This week, the Art of Culinary Spaces rises to the occasion with 7 Stars Bakery, where a new commissary supports its growing artisanal bread operation with efficiency and precision. When faced with unexpected challenges, Real Food Hospitality pivoted their design approach to create a 24/7 production facility worthy of those celebrated baked goods. Join me in welcoming FCSI member Jessica Gates as she reveals the intricate choreography required in designing high-volume bakery operations and how understanding the minute details of bread production informed every aspect of this functional space. Well, we're here today to talk about 7 Stars Bakery, and for season 3, I thought, let's just keep the tradition alive and ask the same first question, which is always, Jessica, how did this project come about for you guys?
Yeah, they found us through the web. I think they had heard about us from client referral, other people that they had worked with. We're based in the Boston area, and 7 Stars is down in Pawtucket, Providence, Rhode Island area, so pretty local to us as well. So I think they just heard about us through the grapevine, sent through a web inquiry, and as we started working with them, we found ourselves to be a really great fit and ended up continuing on with a lot of project work with them.
That's great. I mean, that's kind of an unusual one at times for people to get leads like that. Are you fortunate enough to get a lot of leads through the website?
We do, actually. It's funny. One of the ones that I talked about last time, a project was like a little ice cream shop in my hometown that came through the web. That was not something we sought out. I just saw it come through the web and it was like, I know that name. But I'd say at least 50% of our business that's not associated with our parent company is actually from client referral. So it's really good kind of green flag for the work that we do, that whoever we work with, they don't have more projects for us, but they have friends who have similar projects and our name gets passed along a lot. So really nice. It reminds me of, I posted in my neighborhood Facebook group a couple days ago about a plumber, and I want people to really tell me who they've used and who they like. I don't need Yelp or anything like that. It's nice to hear it from someone directly and a personal contact who has,
Absolutely.
real life experience.
Absolutely. 100% agree with that. So for this project, what was the project's timeline in the beginning and then the budget plan for the beginning? I know it kind of changed, but I'm always curious to see how it was in the beginning versus how it ended up.
For sure. So they'd been operating in the space where they were operating when we began this project for a long time and had outgrown it a long time ago. So while they were really pushing to move out of that space, they also were capable of continuing to operate in that space. And so really the service of the project and making sure that we did it right was really what the timeline was about. So they were willing to be a little bit more flexible on timeline and, rough it at the location where they were at now to make sure that they did it right, because hopefully this is, move out of your parents' house and you move into a house that you want to live in for the rest of time. So, want to make sure that we did all of that right. So I think it was supposed to be a year or two process. One interesting thing that's explored in the article is the idea that we went through multiple different sites and we essentially started this project over a few times because we went through the entire design process to find out that the building couldn't support any of the design that we had done. So the timeline was very active in this project.
You're kind of leading me into my next question, so I appreciate that. So going into timelines, and that's why I wanted to ask what it was in the beginning, because knowing if you read the article that it did change quite a bit, and that is the bakery was going to go into an old factory. And for our listeners here in the podcast, and which was, we know when you're going into some place, renovation sometimes can find out much more complex things than you anticipate, especially versus new construction where you're kind of designing from the ground up. Definitely the case here with the project. Can you walk us through the moment when you and the team realized, the site actually can't handle the electrical load that we need it to? I mean, what was your reaction, and how did your team, as well as the operator team that you're working with, how did you guys respond to that?
Sure. So when we entered the project, the client had already bought this building. So we were working with the building under the assumption that all of these things would be able to be retrofit, even if the building didn't have the capacity that we needed, that we would be able to pull that electrical, from local sources to be able to bump up that power. The ultimate thing that we found out is in order to get the voltage that we needed to site, there would have to be a huge amount of work done on a public street in order to route all of that to this building. So that would involve municipal teams, hiring security and other, public groups to be able to redirect traffic and things like that. It was doable, but the cost that was associated with that was not congruent with the goals of the project. So they were really banking on this building having the opportunity for us to fit all that stuff in, and we went through all of design, and essentially that amperage number that we came up with was way too big for the panels that were there. Amperage can drop when you up the voltage. It didn't have very high voltage, so if we could pull that voltage, we'd be able to make that happen. This was also COVID time, so getting a new electrical panel was one of the longest lead time items. Everyone was like fighting for electrical panels all over the place, so being able to pull in that voltage was much easier than waiting on a lead time for an electrical panel. But that being said, all of those options were not really options for us. So
Yeah, exactly. So you guys went together and you found another location. Actually, you went and looked at a few, but you found a second location, which was a previously shared commissary and a better fit, I guess, because of the humble beginnings. And what made you choose this second one versus the other ones you looked at?
what's funny, the original location was a factory. It was like a lighting factory. So they had all the showrooms. So I think we all, in our kind of rudimentary understanding of lighting, assumed that lighting pulls a lot of power. So I guess it doesn't. This is all just residential lighting. So we realized that we really were needing to look for a space that was operating as a bakery or was operating as a commissary, somewhere that whose operation implied to us that they have the type of high voltage equipment that we would need to. So the client actually paused with us for a bit so that they could sell that building, realize how much capital they had to work with after, giving up on that space. And they specifically looked at bakeries in the area. So they ended up finding one bakery that had kind of turned into a commissary. So they had a storefront and they were doing their own business, but the gentleman who was running the space also rented out the space for local businesses, local food trucks, operations like that, to be able to produce food for their operations just on, a shift basis. And so we knew that multiple different groups were working in the space at once, using all this equipment at once. This gentleman was leading towards retirement, but was not on the edge of retirement. My understanding is that my client made it a very appealing opportunity for him to retire.
Well, and the interesting thing about this too, then, because you were where you were going into, the walk-in refrigeration and the dry storage in the new location, the second one, obviously, that you were able to repurpose those, which is always a little not nicer. I mean, how do you, when you're going into a project like that, and now you're thrown into this second building, and you're looking at all this equipment or areas that are in the current building, how do you personally assess looking at it and determining what's worth saving and repurposing versus that's not going to work, we're going to have to tear that out and start fresh? I mean, what's your process, or how do you determine that?
Yeah, with this one in particular, all of the walk-ins were in really good shape, and they were all actually external to the building. So there wouldn't have been a way to necessarily relocate them within the space, because the space itself would have been the production area, and then there are all these kind of external doors that were open to the doors to these different walk-ins. So knowing that they were in good condition and that we could convert some of them also, walk-ins are pretty easy to convert. You swap out a evaporator panel versus evaporator coil, and it's a freezer now. Swap that out for a different evaporator coil that's a medium temp. Now you have a cooler. You can add wall panels to, bisect boxes as they exist now. So definitely more kind of retrofitting what existed to something that was more conducive to the operation without totally starting from scratch. Those are expensive boxes. Demo of those would have been huge, and they were all in neat condition.
Oh, nice. Now, as I understand it, you became somewhat a professional baker along the way too, because you decided to shadow the bakery staff through the various different parts of the operation. When you were doing the shadow like that, obviously bakery and being a baker isn't your profession. What surprised you the most about as you were able to go from shadowing from section to section to section?
A bakery is one of the most interesting operations, in my opinion, because it's never dead. So many restaurants, there are huge hours of the day where lights are off, nothing's on, doors are locked. Bakeries operate every single second of the day. They have overnight shifts to get things out at 6 a.m. delivery times. They have morning shifts to get, lunch product out. They have evening shifts to get everything ready to ship overnight. And so all of these different kind of product categories really have to have a paced sequence about them so that they absorb a space the second that the previous process left that space. So it's just this continuous carousel of product to make the volume work. So our very first exercises were with this client before we even knew anything about this building were really to map out all of their products, where they are, how they function, how they relate to each other in terms of time and in terms of equipment, so that we could really maximize the way that this space would be able to function related to every one of their products and no area would ever be dead. So it was a really cool kind of flow chart that we made. It was almost like if you made like a high level queuing chart at like an airport, but instead of people, it's like muffins and like olive bread, which is really fun. So it was cool to kind of map all of that out. And what we designed at the original location was definitely very specific to those different products. And so when we got the new space, it was really about kind of converging the elite choreography that we had designed for that new space with the conditions that we were stuck with kind of with this one that we were going to explore that was previously a bakery. So understanding exactly how to kind of route the traffic of all of these products to be able to use those walk-ins, because people and product are moving around a lot too. And so you never want the intersections. People need to know that they're walking in this direction and they're not going to hit a traffic light. You can go exactly where you go and no, personnel clashing or intersecting along the way. So a lot of that was just to keep the flow moving and to utilize all of the spaces as efficiently and for as many minutes of the day as possible.
Now, how were you able to differentiate like what the difference was between, let's say, operational habits and like best practices for a high volume bakery? And actually, let's jump back a quick second, because I know we haven't quite talked about what the bakery actually does. It's not just a little local bakery. We're talking about a very large bakery that supplies a lot of people. So let's go back a little bit and let's tell the audience kind of what they do, what Seven Stars does.
Totally. Seven Stars is a wonderful organization. If anybody knows anyone in Rhode Island, say Seven Stars, and someone's eyes are going to light up. Everybody in Rhode Island knows about Seven Stars. They started as a small local bakery, ended up having a bunch of brick and mortar like lunch cafe stores that they supply for themselves, but they got a lot of attention for their product and ended up being able to partner with big enough companies like Whole Foods in the area to supply, bulk product, breads, etc., to grocery stores, to markets, to things like that. So really started
Wow.
small, then had their own stores, and then were able to kind of market that product outside of their own organization. And they're very well known in the area, and their cafes are still highly frequented, and they're still adding cafes. So I think they're up to like 7 of them now, which is exciting,
Wow.
but they keep popping up and they are making money. So they keep growing.
That's a great story. So sorry, I didn't want to go back too much, but I appreciate that because I realized we hadn't talked about that yet. So going back to how were you able to determine whether the difference between a habit of the staff or whether it's a best practice moving forward?
I love that question because it's the most important question in this project, in my opinion, because like we were talking about earlier, they were in a space that they had outgrown and all of their processes were reactions to the conditions that they were in. So I don't even think that they knew moment to moment whether what they were doing was a function of the parameters of the space or the best practice they would if they could imagine it. So that being said, you never want to completely start over because they have existing staff who are used to particular processes. These processes work for them right now. And so being able to really meld, start from scratch, perfectly designed execution of this with the practices that they're comfortable with and that they found to work was absolutely the goal. So simple as it may sound, the question is just why. Every time we're walking through a product and they say we go from here to here and then here to here, and go, why do you do that? And sometimes it was like, well, the product needs to sit for this long and that's how that product can respond to this process. And sometimes it was, that's the only table that's open. And that's what will tell you whether or not it was an intentional choice or just a reaction to their, circumstances. Really digging into that and understanding if the answer was, well, that's the only table that was open, then you'd say, okay, if I had a whole nother room over here where you could put any equipment and you could roll anything into and you could use that for this process, what would it look like? Would it look different or would it not? And a lot of times that was a question they hadn't really explored because they never had the opportunity to consider what these could look like in a larger space. So definitely a
Right, because
lot.
you just get used to doing how you've got to get it out, right? You've got deadlines. You just make it work. You don't realize, and sometimes you don't even know why you do it. You just, well, that's the way we did it because, like you said, it was the only table available. So that's why we used it. So now you also got to work with a manufacturer to create some custom equipment here. So and then you described this baking room as which is a little odd as far as both stunning and highly engineered. So I can't wait to hear about the equipment you guys came up with to get manufactured for this. So tell us a little bit about what you had to do to get this going.
Definitely. So that manufacturer is called Sinelli. They're based in Italy, and they do exclusively baking equipment, very hydraulic specific baking equipment. So not just a normal mixer, but the kind that lifts itself up and dumps its own dough onto a table. Very high volume, very high level of technology. They had worked, Sarah, who's the head baker at Seven Stars, who was my main contact for this. She had experience with this manufacturer. I'd done a lot of research into what would work for their space. So this manufacturer itself was a selection of the client. But what that manufacturer was going to make very custom for us was a conversation between all of us for a long time. So in the old space, they had one, I believe, 5 or 6 deck oven and a hydraulic loader. So big assembly with a conveyor where I'm there at 4 a.m. and a gentleman is grabbing dough, placing the dough 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 across the conveyor, scoring or doing whatever the finishing touches, press a button, and that conveyor zips back one bread's increment. And then he does 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, zoop, and it goes until the whole bed is full. That whole thing then lifts up, boop, boop, boop on a controller to tell it which deck to go to and how hot we want that deck. And then that entire conveyor lifts up and rolls the product into the oven. Once that product is done, that conveyor lifts back up, pulls all that conveyor style out of the oven, lifts it back down, and then you can remove all the product. So very robotic, very interesting, but they had outgrown that oven. And part of what we wanted to design with Sinelli was a multi-axis loader. So instead of they knew they needed 2 large multi-deck ovens. But the question was, does each of these ovens have its own loader? Or is there a way to have a loader that can service both of these ovens? Which would mean that not only does it have to go back and forth and up and down, it also has to go left to right. And that's what we designed. So they have 2 very large multi-deck ovens with 1 loader, and it works exactly the same way as I described. But instead of just going up, it might also go over and then up. So they can use this 1 loader to respond to both of these ovens at once. There's also an unloading capacity to it as well, where the conveyor will actually come back towards you and the product will drop into a chute onto a table. So you're also not manually unloading it. So the most manual part is just filling up that conveyor deck in order to feed it to the oven. And then the oven and that loader do most of the work from there.
So you've talked a little bit about the conveyors and everything, but there's also this giant hook and everything that's described in the article. So I guess to paint a picture for our audience, help me describe the automated baking process from the dough mixing to where they get to the point where they score and then go into the oven too, if you don't mind.
Yeah, absolutely. So they have big flour mills where they're milling all of their, raw product that's coming in. These big mixers, part of the point of them is that they're high volume, and the hydraulics related to the dumping is because dough is very, very heavy in that volume. Think of how heavy water is, and think of how heavy flour is, and think of how heavy you mixing those together with some air becomes, and it's just one big sticky lump of weight, and it's impossible for a person to remove that from the bowl. And so the idea that they can mix in these volumes and use this technology to be able to assist with that. They still have a big scraper, and they might have to because it is very sticky, so they might have to unstick some of it, but they're not physically maneuvering any of this product anymore. Big plop of the dough down onto a table, and then that gets rolled over to metering stations. So the metering stations are where they're going to weigh out the amount of dough that they want to portion out depending on the product that they're using. So one of their most famous products is their olive bread. And they get all of their olives in with the pits and unpit every single olive for this olive bread. So know how much labor went into that when you have their delicious olive bread. But let's say that they're portioning out for their olive bread. They have this table with weight meters, water meters, things like that, which also assists in making sure that the flour to water ratio when they're mixing is correct. They're going to portion these out into dough bins, and then they're going to stack those dough bins. Those dough bins then get rolled out to a shaping table where they're going to take the lumps out, portion them out into the space that they would need to be and shape them, and then place them on a rack that would then get rolled into a proofing room or a retarding room, depending on what the product is, maybe into a freezer if it needs to blast freeze overnight or something like that. So some sort of kind of idle part of the process. Once it is ready to be baked, it's then rolled out of one of those cavities into the baking room, and off that rack is where they plop them down onto that conveyor and do the final scoring and touches. And then after they come off of the conveyor, they get rolled into the cooling room. They're obviously still very hot. So big industrial looking fans like you'd see at the airport or something like that, and big racks. And it's just blowing cold air at all of these until they cool to a temperature where they can be packaged and sent out to their delivery station.
Wow. Very complex, much more than most people probably realize, just to get some olive loaf bread out.
Yeah, I mean, it's little things that we do. It's just the volume that makes it different. Like if I'm making cookies, I make the big batch of dough, and then I am going to portion out my little balls. I'm going to place them. I'm going to flatten them, and I'm going to put it in the oven. I have to wait for them to cool. These are all recognizable parts of the process. But when you extend them into this scale and capacity, the amount of space that it requires and the amount of attention and time that it requires is, a direct relationship to that scaling.
The only difference is in the cookies that you're creating for yourself, you're actually portioning off how much you're going to eat of the dough that's not going to get baked. So being eaten raw on the side too. So I don't think they're doing that with their olive loaf bread, but the cookies definitely you have to do that.
Yeah. Well, we make a lot of cookies too. And one of my favorite other pieces of equipment is called a sheeter. So they plop the cookie dough down onto a sheeter, and this sheeter just gradually becomes skinnier and skinnier as it's rolling the dough through. So it can very gently flatten it into exactly what they need. And then they also have like cookie cutting machines. So it's this big conveyor and the cookies go through, and a big plate stamps them into the shape. They come out with that shape, and then they take all the little extras around the edge, smash them up, put them back in the sheeter. So we're not losing any sort of product.
Oh, very cool. That's very, very cool. Again, another great visual. Thank you for doing that. Well, now that you've done this project, you kind of become your firm's go-to bakery expert. When you've done a few bakeries now, what have you done differently, or what are some of the biggest maybe misconceptions of bakery design versus other facilities you design?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing I'd say is that there's a lot more what I'll call dance floor space in a bakery than there are in other operations, because of how many things are moving around, how much personnel is moving around, and how many things need parking spaces. There are hundreds and hundreds of, bun pan racks, rolling racks, those dough bins, things like that when they're not actively in use, they need to live somewhere. So in, a very small a la carte restaurant, I'm using every square inch. Like if you're not standing there working, I'm putting a shelf there, something there. But in this space, the idea that you maximally, fill that bag in means that people are dodging around equipment, and it's just not as, the traffic patterns are not as gracious towards the processes that are going on. So it was almost a little hard for me at first. I'm like, but there's so much wasted space. And they're like, it's not wasted. We need this. Like there are 15 people that need to stand around this table. We're all assembling these sandwiches in an hour. If 15 people can't fit around this table and other people can roll by them with these racks, then we haven't done our job correctly. So big pivot in terms of kind of the ratio of clearance and movement space to equipment space.
Wow. Interesting. Very good. Well, that's all the questions I've got for you today, Jessica. I really appreciate you joining the show. But before we let you go, tell us a little bit about how the public can find out more about you and Real Food Hospitality Strategy and Design.
Sounds great. Yeah. I'm Jessica Gates. I'm a design project manager at Real Food, RFHSD, it's our little moniker. We are a subdivision of Troon, which is a golf management company. So we do a lot of clubs and things as well, but we are still our own proprietary company. And so we have all of our, own business as well. RFHSD.com is where you can go to find that lovely web inquiry where the 7 Stars group originally found us. You can also find me on LinkedIn and anything like that. But we also recently absorbed an interiors team from our parent company. So really expanding kind of our design capacity in addition to the strategy and operations department that we have going on as well. And are always open to new types of projects and learning. Like you were saying, wait, 5 or so years ago, if a bakery project came in where we would not know what to do, we would definitely go for it and learn what we need to, but we wouldn't have necessarily had the background to post a portfolio related to that segment. But now we can, and we're never scared of those kinds of opportunities.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of the Art of Culinary Spaces. We hope this conversation has sparked your creativity and inspired new ideas within the world of food service design and planning. Make sure to hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss out on all of our future podcasts. Stay tuned for our next episode when we explore another groundbreaking project and exceptional design from FCSI members that are transforming the culinary landscape.